Imagine Paris in the early 19th century. The streets are filled with soldiers, banners, and the echo of drums. France is not just a country, it is the center of an empire, and at its heart stands one man, Napoleon Bonaparte. He is the conqueror of Europe, the emperor who crowns himself, the man who bends kings and popes to his will. But power has a hunger of its own, and Napoleon's ambitions do not end on the battlefield. History tells us he had only one legitimate son, the King of Rome, Napoleon II. Yet whispers speak of many more, born in secret, scattered across Europe, hidden from the public eye. What if, in another world, Napoleon had chosen one of those boys? What if he brought a child of his own blood into the palace, not as an heir to succeed him, but as a partner to share his throne? In this parallel tale, Napoleon is not just a general or an emperor. He is a father who dares to cross the boundaries of morality, religion, and even nature itself. He arranges a marriage unthinkable to us, one between himself and his 15-year-old son. A union designed not for love, but for power. An alliance meant to make his dynasty eternal. This is not the Napoleon you know from history books. This is the story of a forbidden crown, a scandal that could have changed the world forever. Welcome to Tales from a Parallel World. Paris, 1810. The empire of Napoleon shines brighter than ever. His armies march across Europe. His banners fly from Spain to Poland, and his enemies whisper his name with fear. Yet behind the victories and the grand ceremonies, there is another story, one hidden in shadows, spoken only in whispers. It is the story of a boy, born not of a queen or a princess, but of a woman history barely remembers. The boy's name in this parallel tale is Charles. He is one of Napoleon's many illegitimate sons, though in our world his existence was never recorded. His mother was a young noblewoman from the countryside of Burgundy, a brief passion in the life of the emperor. When Charles was born, he was hidden away, raised in secret by caretakers who were paid in silence and gold. From the beginning, Charles felt he was different. He was taught languages, music, and the art of fencing. His tutors told him he must always be prepared, though they never explained why. He saw little of his mother, who was kept under strict watch. But every now and then, a soldier would arrive with gifts, a small sword, a book of military strategy, or a miniature portrait of the emperor himself. Charles studied the portrait endlessly. The strong jaw, the piercing eyes, the aura of command, it was the face of his father, though no one dared to say it aloud. For years he lived in the shadow of a secret, waiting for a truth he could feel but not yet touch. Then, on his 15th birthday, everything changed. A black carriage arrived at the estate where Charles was kept. Its windows were curtained, its wheels heavy with mud. Two officers in imperial uniform stepped down, their expressions cold and formal. "You are to come with us," one of them said. No explanation, no farewell. Within hours, Charles was on the road to Paris. The journey was long and silent. Charles looked out at the countryside of France, villages, rivers, endless fields, and wondered what awaited him at the end. When the carriage finally entered the city, he was struck by its grandeur. Paris was alive with noise and color, soldiers parading through the streets, merchants calling from their stalls, the bells of Notre Dame echoing above it all. For Charles, who had lived his life in seclusion, it was overwhelming. At last, the carriage stopped before the Tuileries Palace, the seat of imperial power. Guards saluted, and the great iron gates opened. Charles's heart raced. He knew, without being told, that he was about to meet the man whose shadow had always loomed over him. Inside the palace, everything gleamed with gold and marble. Servants hurried past, bowing as the officers led Charles through vast corridors lined with portraits of kings and emperors. Finally, they arrived at a chamber where the air seemed to grow heavier, as if history itself waited inside. The doors opened. There, standing beneath a chandelier, was Napoleon Bonaparte. He was shorter than Charles had imagined, yet his presence filled the room. His uniform was immaculate, his medals glittered, and his eyes burned with an intensity that seemed to pierce through flesh and bone. For a moment, Charles could not breathe. This was not just a man. This was the Emperor, the father he had never truly known. Napoleon studied him in silence. Then, with a rare softness, he spoke. "You look like me when I was your age." The words struck Charles like a thunderclap. His chest tightened, his hands trembled. At last, the unspoken truth was revealed. He was not just a boy from Burgundy. He was the blood of Bonaparte. In the days that followed, Charles remained in the palace. He was given fine clothes, better tutors, and a place at Napoleon's side during meals. Yet he soon realized this was no ordinary reunion. His father was not simply curious. Napoleon was watching him, measuring him, as a general studies a soldier before battle. One evening, while the candles flickered and maps of Europe lay scattered across the Emperor's desk, Napoleon spoke again. "You are my son," he said, "and more than that, you are my reflection. The world will not accept this truth, not yet. But I have plans for you, Charles, plans that will ensure my empire endures, even if the whole world turns against me." Charles listened in silence, his heart torn between awe and fear. He admired his father's brilliance, the way his voice carried the weight of destiny, but beneath the admiration was unease. There was something in Napoleon's gaze that unsettled him, a hunger not just for power but for control, absolute and unchallenged. Rumors spread quickly through the palace. Servants whispered of a boy who resembled the emperor. Ministers exchanged nervous glances. No one dared to question Napoleon openly, but all knew that something unusual was happening. Charles was not treated as a bastard hidden in shame. He was being elevated, brought into the circle of power, prepared for a role no one could yet imagine. At night, alone in his chamber, Charles wrestled with his thoughts. He had dreamed of this moment, of being acknowledged, of walking in the light of his father's greatness. Yet the reality felt heavier than any dream. Was he truly ready to bear the name Bonaparte? And why did his father's plans feel so unnatural? The answer would come soon, in a revelation that would shock not only Charles, but the entire empire. Napoleon did not see him as merely an heir. He saw him as something far stranger, far more dangerous. In a world where thrones were secured by blood and alliances, the emperor was about to cross a line no ruler had dared to touch. And Charles, whether he willed it or not, would be at the center of it. Spring of 1811. Paris was alive with music, carriages, and endless chatter. The emperor had announced that a special ceremony would take place inside the Tuileries palace. No details were given, but whispers spread like wildfire. Some said it was a treaty with the Pope. Others believed it was the announcement of a new heir. But no one could have guessed the truth. Behind the golden doors of the palace, Napoleon prepared for something the world had never seen. His son, Charles, only 15, was dressed in a suit of fine velvet, deep blue embroidered with gold. His hair was combed neatly, his hands gloved, but his eyes betrayed the confusion in his heart. He did not fully understand what was about to happen. Napoleon, on the other hand, was calm, determined, almost radiant. He stood in his imperial uniform, the eagle of France shining on his chest, his sword polished until it caught the light of every candle. For him, this day was not about tradition or religion. It was about destiny. The chamber was prepared like a wedding hall. Rows of ministers, generals, and courtiers stood stiffly, their faces pale. A few priests had been forced to attend, though their lips trembled as they whispered prayers. None dared to oppose the emperor. To resist Napoleon was to invite exile or worse. Charles glanced at the rows of faces, searching for a friend, for someone to protect him, but found only silence. He felt as though he was standing at the edge of a cliff, pushed forward by invisible hands. Then the music began. A small orchestra played softly as Napoleon walked toward his son. The silence of the room was heavy, broken only by the strings. Napoleon reached out and placed his hand on Charles's shoulder. His voice was low, steady, filled with authority. "Today," he said, "we unite not as father and son, but as rulers of the same destiny. Together, we will forge an empire no force can destroy. Together, we will be eternal." Charles's throat tightened. He wanted to speak, to protest, to run, but his legs refused to move. The weight of his father's gaze pressed down on him, stronger than chains. The priest stepped forward, his hands trembling as he held the book of prayers. He hesitated, but Napoleon's sharp eyes cut through him like a blade. The ceremony began. Each word fell like thunder in Charles's ears. The verses of marriage, the vows of unity, the promises of loyalty, words meant for lovers, now spoken between a man and his own blood. The boy's hands shook as he repeated the lines Napoleon forced upon him. When the rings were presented, Charles could no longer contain himself. He whispered, almost pleading, "Father, please!" Napoleon silenced him with a single look, a look that said, "You are mine. You have no choice." The emperor slid the ring onto Charles's finger. Gold, heavy, cold. The symbol of a bond that should never exist. The orchestra swelled, but the music sounded hollow, almost mocking. When the priest declared them united, the room erupted in uneasy applause. No one smiled. No one dared. Ministers clapped with trembling hands. Generals stared at the floor. The priests crossed themselves, as if trying to wash away their own sin. Outside the palace, cannons fired in celebration. The city cheered without knowing the truth. The people believed their emperor had secured another great alliance. They did not know the darkness that had just unfolded within those gilded walls. That night, a banquet was held. The tables overflowed with food and wine, chandeliers bathed the room in golden light, and musicians played endlessly. But beneath the splendor was fear. The guests spoke in whispers, careful not to let their true thoughts escape. Was this the act of genius, or the madness of a tyrant? Charles sat beside Napoleon at the high table, dressed now in a robe of crimson, trimmed with fur. His face was pale, his hands still shaking. Every time he tried to eat, the food turned to ash in his mouth. He could feel the eyes of the court upon him, pity from some, disgust from others. Napoleon, however, was radiant. He raised his glass and declared, "Tonight, France has secured its future. My blood will rule forever. No priest, no king, no nation can break what I have created." The hall echoed with forced applause. As the night dragged on, Charles felt trapped in a nightmare. Every smile, every cheer, every clink of glass seemed unreal, like a play performed in hell. When the banquet finally ended, he retreated to his chamber, collapsing onto the bed. Tears came, hot and bitter. He was 15, a child, and yet he had been bound to his father in a way no child should ever endure. In the days that followed, the world outside remained unaware. Official proclamations called the ceremony a sacred union for the glory of France. Propaganda painted Charles as the chosen heir, destined to share the throne. Portraits were commissioned of father and son, standing side by side, like twin rulers of the same empire. But inside the palace, tension grew. Ministers whispered of rebellion. Priests debated excommunication. Generals wondered if they could still follow a man who had crossed not only the laws of men, but of God. For Charles, the palace became a prison. Everywhere he went, guards followed. His lessons continued, but now with a darker tone. Napoleon demanded he learn not just the art of war, but the art of command, how to give orders, how to demand obedience. Charles obeyed outwardly, but inside he felt a storm building. He loved his father, and yet he feared him. He admired his power, and yet he despised what had been done to him. Every night he lay awake wondering, was he still Charles, or had he become nothing more than a reflection of Napoleon's madness? The impossible wedding had changed everything. France was still an empire, Napoleon was still its master, but the line between love and power, between family and tyranny, had been erased. And in that erasure, a shadow grew, a shadow that would one day consume them both. The marriage was done. The empire had swallowed the scandal, dressed it in gold, and presented it as destiny. Portraits of Napoleon and Charles hung in galleries, both dressed in robes of state, their crowns nearly touching, as if two suns now rose over France. Official decrees called them the twin rulers of Europe. To the public, Charles was no longer an illegitimate child. He was the emperor's chosen partner, his equal in power. But inside the palace, reality was far more complicated. At first, Charles was treated with ceremony. He was given his own chamber near the emperor's, furnished with velvet drapes and golden mirrors. He was seated beside Napoleon at banquets, introduced to foreign envoys as His Imperial Highness. He was placed at the head of councils, though he spoke little, his hands clenched beneath the table. For the boy, life became a theatre. Every smile was rehearsed, every gesture observed, every step measured. Ministers bowed to him, but their eyes betrayed disgust. Generals saluted, but whispered in corridors that France was now ruled by madness. Charles felt their judgment like daggers piercing his skin. Napoleon, however, thrived. He strutted through the halls with renewed vigor, declaring that France had entered a new age. Together, he told his ministers, my son and I are one will, one crown. The world will tremble before us. His voice carried not just pride, but defiance, as if daring anyone to question him. Yet in private, the balance of power was fragile. Napoleon expected obedience from Charles, the same obedience he demanded from his armies. But Charles was no longer a child in the shadows. He was 15, standing at the threshold of manhood, his spirit restless, his thoughts his own. He began to ask questions. "Father," he said one evening as they walked through the gardens of the Tuileries, "what if the people do not accept me? What if they see this union as unnatural?" Napoleon stopped, fixing him with a gaze that silenced armies. "The people accept what I command them to accept. You must learn this, Charles. Power is not about truth. It is about control." The words chilled the boy. He realized then that this marriage was not a bond of love, nor even of legacy. It was a chain forged of blood, ambition, and fear. Weeks turned into months. Together, Napoleon and Charles appeared at parades reviewing the troops. Father and son rode side by side on white horses, the cheers of the soldiers rising like thunder. But Charles noticed something unsettling. The soldiers' eyes often lingered on him, not with respect, but with unease. He was young, pale, and visibly burdened. Some muttered that the emperor had cursed his own dynasty. Foreign powers were no less disturbed. Ambassadors from Austria and Prussia sent secret letters back to their courts, describing the strange situation in Paris. The Pope, furious and scandalized, considered open condemnation, though he feared Napoleon's retaliation. Across Europe, rulers whispered that the emperor had finally gone too far. Inside the palace, Charles's world grew darker. Napoleon demanded that he sit through endless councils of war, learning strategy, absorbing the science of conquest. Maps covered the tables, pins marking fortresses and borders. Charles listened, but his mind drifted. He was haunted by dreams of freedom, of escape, of being simply a boy again. One night, after a long council, he dared to speak his truth. "Father," he said softly, "I never asked for this. I never asked to be your reflection." Napoleon's eyes flashed. He rose from his chair and slammed his fist on the table. "You are not allowed to ask. You are Bonaparte. You are mine." and together we will rule, whether the world accepts it or not." The words rang through the chamber like cannon fire. Charles lowered his gaze, but inside, a storm raged. The ministers noticed the tension. In secret, some began to plot. "If the boy resists his father," they whispered, "perhaps he can be turned. Perhaps he will save France from this madness." Others feared he would become as ruthless as Napoleon, molded in the same fire. The people of Paris, meanwhile, invented rumors. Some said Charles was enchanted, bound to Napoleon by sorcery. Others claimed he was a puppet, nothing more than a hostage dressed in silk. Mothers warned their children not to speak the emperor's name too loudly, as if his power extended even into the shadows of their homes. And yet, despite the whispers, life at the court continued. There were banquets, hunts, operas. Napoleon demanded appearances of joy, and so the empire smiled, even as fear gnawed at its heart. Charles played his role, but every day he felt himself slipping further from who he had been. He looked in mirrors and saw not a boy, but a stranger draped in gold. He wondered if he still belonged to himself, or if his father had consumed him entirely. The breaking point came during a military review at the Champ de Mars. Thousands of soldiers stood in perfect lines, banners snapping in the wind. Napoleon and Charles rode before them, the drums pounding. Suddenly, Napoleon raised his hand and declared, "Behold my son. He is my equal, my partner, my eternal ally. From this day forward, France shall know two emperors." The soldiers cheered, but the sound was hollow. Charles felt their unease, their confusion. He raised his hand weakly, but his eyes betrayed him. He wanted to disappear. Later that night, he confronted his father. "Why must I be your equal?" he asked. "Why can't I be simply your son?" Napoleon's expression hardened. "Because sons can betray, equals cannot." The words struck Charles like a dagger. He realized in that moment that his father did not see him as a child or even as family. He was a mirror, a tool, a symbol in the emperor's endless war against the world and against fate itself. In the weeks that followed, Charles began to change. The fear in his eyes hardened into resolve. He moved more confidently, spoke more directly, even contradicted his father in council. Napoleon's ministers noticed, and hope flickered in their hearts. Perhaps the boy was not broken. Perhaps he might one day defy the emperor. But Napoleon noticed too, and he did not forgive. For the first time, cracks appeared in the reign of the two Napoleons. Father and son, bound by a forbidden marriage, stood not as allies, but as rivals, two wills colliding beneath one crown. And in that collision, the fate of the empire began to unravel. The empire could not hold forever. Even the strongest walls crack when the weight becomes too heavy, and the reign of the two Napoleons was built on a foundation of fear and silence. By 1812, the first signs of collapse began to appear. Generals grumbled openly in private chambers. Priests whispered that God himself had abandoned France. In the streets of Paris, people no longer shouted, "Vive l'Empereur," with the same fire. Some lowered their voices, others turned away. Rumors of the impossible marriage had begun to spread, carried on the lips of merchants, soldiers, even servants who had glimpsed too much. Charles felt the change as keenly as anyone. Once, he had been a boy trapped in silence. Now, at 16, he was becoming a young man with his own voice. His tutors taught him Latin, law, and the art of diplomacy. But more importantly, he was learning the art of resistance. He began to meet secretly with ministers who despised his father's madness. They spoke of a France restored, a France freed from the shadow of the emperor, and Charles listened. Still, he was torn. His heart ached with love and fear for his father. Napoleon was the man who had lifted him from obscurity, who had given him power and recognition. Yet he was also the man who had stolen his childhood, binding him in a chain of shame. The conflict consumed Charles until he could no longer sleep. Then came Russia. In this parallel world, as in ours, Napoleon launched his great invasion of the Russian Empire. He boasted that he would crush the Tsar and bring Moscow to its knees. But this time he brought Charles with him, not as a soldier, but as his consort, his symbol, his other half. The army marched east, banners fluttering, drums pounding, but many soldiers whispered behind their teeth. They no longer trusted their emperor. They no longer believed in his divine star. The campaign was a disaster. Hunger, snow, and endless marches broke the spirit of the army. Men deserted by the thousands. In the frozen silence of Russia, Charles witnessed the true cost of his father's ambition. Bodies frozen in the snow, villages burned to ashes, soldiers weeping in the night. He began to see Napoleon not as a god, but as a man consumed by his own fire. One night, as the two sat in a frozen tent, Charles spoke words he had never dared before. "Father," he said softly, "you are destroying us. You are destroying me." Napoleon's eyes burned in the candlelight. "You are me," he hissed. "You are my blood, my reflection. If I fall, you fall. There is no you without me." The words struck Charles like chains tightening around his throat. He realized then that he would never be free, not unless he broke those chains himself. When the army limped back from Russia, shattered and humiliated, France was no longer the same. Enemies rose on every border. Britain, Austria, Prussia, and Russia joined forces to crush the wounded empire. Inside Paris, ministers plotted more boldly, and the people began to whisper of revolt. And in the center of it all stood Charles, torn between loyalty and rebellion. The breaking point came in 1814, when the coalition armies advanced on Paris. The city trembled as cannons roared in the distance. Napoleon, furious and desperate, demanded his son stand by his side on the ramparts, dressed in armor, holding the imperial banner. But Charles refused. For the first time, he looked into his father's eyes and said, "No, I will not be part of this madness anymore." The silence that followed was heavier than any cannon fire. Napoleon's face twisted with rage, then with something far worse, betrayal. "You would defy me," he thundered. "You would abandon your own blood?" Charles's voice shook, but his words were clear. "I will not abandon France. I will not abandon myself." The palace shook with the emperor's fury. Some say he struck his son across the face. Others say he collapsed into silence. But from that moment forward, the bond was broken. When Paris finally surrendered, the coalition demanded Napoleon's abdication. In our world, he named his legitimate son Napoleon II as heir. But in this parallel tale, there was no such heir. The illegitimate child he had married, the boy he had tried to mold into his reflection, had turned against him. Alone, abandoned, Napoleon signed the abdication. His empire crumbled like sand between his fingers. He was sent into exile, not to Elba, but to a darker prison, his own legacy forever tainted by scandal. And what of Charles? Some say he vanished into obscurity, protected by ministers who pitied him. Others claim he took part in the restoration of the Bourbon monarchy, standing silently among the crowd as Louis XVIII returned to the throne. In whispers, it was said that Charles carried scars no eye could see. The scars of being both son and husband, victim and partner of the greatest conqueror of his age. The church ordered every trace of the marriage erased. Paintings were burned, documents destroyed, priests sworn to silence. To speak of it was heresy, to remember it was treason. And so the impossible wedding of Napoleon and his son faded into the shadows, buried beneath layers of denial. But shadows never truly vanish. Even decades later, in the salons of Paris and the taverns of Marseille, old men would lower their voices and say, "Do you know the truth of the emperor? Do you know the sin that doomed him?" Their listeners would lean in, half horrified, half fascinated, and the tale would spread like smoke through the centuries. And here we are in another world, Opening that forbidden book once more, what does it teach us? That power, when unchecked, devours even the most sacred bonds. That a man who would conquer the world might also seek to conquer his own blood. That love, twisted by ambition, becomes tyranny, and that tyranny, no matter how gilded, always ends in ruin. In this parallel history, Napoleon was not defeated by armies or coalitions. He was defeated by himself, by the hunger that drove him to cross a line no man should ever cross. And Charles, the boy who once trembled in silence, became the silent witness of that downfall. His name lost, his story erased, but his ghost still walking the corridors of history, whispering of what might have been. This is the forbidden memory of France, the marriage erased from history, the empire that could never endure, the tale of a father, a son, and a crown that destroyed them both.